Samuel L. Jackson, is in a war with Donald Trump over
the misinformation is about voting, the spread of distrust of
Samuel L. Jackson, the legendary Hollywood actor known for his commanding presence and sharp tongue, took to television to unleash a fiery verbal assault on newly elected President Donald Trump. The moment was nothing short of explosive. Jackson, never one to mince words, delivered a searing critique that left the audience stunned and the political world buzzing. This was not just another celebrity expressing discontent, this was an obliteration, an uncompromising, razor-sharp takedown of Trump's character, policies, and what Jackson saw as the dangers looming over the country under his leadership. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Jackson's speech was an electrifying moment in television history. From the moment he appeared on screen, there was a charged energy, as if everyone watching knew that something monumental was about to unfold. His face was a mixture of frustration and determination, his voice steady yet laced with controlled fury. Unlike many public figures who cautiously navigate their words when criticizing a newly elected president, Jackson held nothing back. He spoke with the same confidence and intensity that made him one of Hollywood's most revered actors. But this time, the script was real life, and the stakes were far greater than any movie he had ever starred in. Throughout his address, Jackson systematically deconstructed Trump's rhetoric, his controversial campaign promises, and the deeply divisive nature of his rise to power. He pointed out how Trump's campaign had not been about uniting the country, but rather about stoking fear, anger, and resentment. With each sentence, Jackson painted a picture of a man who had capitalized on division rather than sought to heal it, and he warned that this approach could have dangerous consequences for the nation. What made Jackson's critique so powerful was not just the content of his words, but the way he delivered them. He spoke with the kind of conviction that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss his words as mere celebrity posturing. There was a raw authenticity to his message, a sense that he was not just speaking as an actor or a public figure, but as an American deeply concerned about the direction his country was taking. His language was biting but not reckless, passionate but not exaggerated. Every word carried weight, and the impact was undeniable. One of the most striking aspects of Jackson's speech was his ability to highlight not only the flaws in Trump's character, but also the broader implications of his leadership. He spoke about the erosion of trust in institutions, the growing normalization of hate speech, and the dangerous precedent set by a leader who seemed more interested in his own ego than in the well-being of the American people. He questioned whether the country could afford 4 years of a president who thrived on chaos and controversy, and he made it clear that silence in the face of such leadership was not an option. Jackson's words resonated far beyond the television screen. Social media erupted within moments, with clips of his speech spreading like wildfire. Supporters of his message praised him for saying what many were thinking but were too afraid to vocalize. His words gave voice to a growing frustration among those who feared what a Trump presidency would mean for civil rights, democracy, and the country's standing in the world. At the same time, his speech ignited a fierce backlash from Trump's supporters, who dismissed it as yet another example of Hollywood elitism, attempting to undermine the will of the people. Yet, Jackson was undeterred by potential criticism. He made it clear that his message was not about party politics or personal vendettas, it was about accountability. He called upon Americans to remain vigilant, to pay attention, and to refuse to normalize behaviors and policies that went against the very principles the country was founded on. He warned that complacency was the real enemy, and that if people allowed themselves to be distracted by spectacle and rhetoric, they would wake up to a reality far worse than they had ever imagined. What made this moment particularly historic was the fact that Jackson was not a politician, a journalist, or a pundit. He was an entertainer who had chosen to use his platform to take a stand. In doing so, he demonstrated the increasing role of celebrities in political discourse, a trend that had been growing in recent years. His speech was a reminder that in times of great political upheaval, voices from unexpected places could carry immense power. He was not bound by the usual diplomatic language of political figures, nor did he have to worry about maintaining bipartisan appeal. He was free to speak the truth as he saw it, and that freedom made his words even more piercing. Jackson's critique extended beyond Trump himself to the forces that had enabled his rise. He spoke about the media's role in normalizing inflammatory rhetoric, about political leaders who had chosen personal gain over principles, and about the responsibility of everyday citizens to challenge injustice rather than passively accept it. His speech was not just an attack on a single individual, it was a call to action, a wake-up call for a nation that he feared was on the brink of something dangerous. Even those who did not agree with Jackson's perspective had to acknowledge the impact of his words. His speech was not just another celebrity rant, it was a moment of cultural and political significance. It forced uncomfortable conversations, it challenged narratives, and it made it impossible to ignore the deep divisions that had been laid bare by Trump's election. Jackson had taken a sledgehammer to the carefully crafted image of Trump as a leader who spoke for the forgotten American, exposing the contradictions and hypocrisies that lay beneath. In the days that followed, media outlets dissected Jackson's words, analyzing their implications and debating their accuracy. Some praised him for his bravery, while others accused him of deepening the divisions he claimed to oppose. But regardless of where one stood politically, there was no denying that his speech had left an indelible mark. It was a moment that encapsulated the anger, fear, and uncertainty gripping the country. And it served as a stark reminder that the battle for America's future was only just beginning. What Jackson had done was more than just criticize. He had issued a challenge. He had dared people to look beyond slogans and sound bites, to examine the realities of the political landscape, and to demand more from their leaders. He had reminded Americans that democracy was not a passive system, but one that required engagement, vigilance, and courage. In his passionate, unfiltered way, he had captured the mood of a nation on edge, and whether one agreed with him or not, his words could not be ignored. As the dust settled from Jackson's explosive television appearance, the question remained: would his words spark action, or would they be dismissed as just another moment in an increasingly chaotic political era? One thing was certain: Samuel L. Jackson had not just spoken his mind, he had sent a shockwave through the political landscape, proving that in times of great upheaval, even a single voice, when wielded with passion and truth, could shake the very foundations of power. Samuel L. Jackson's blistering critique of Donald Trump's election was not just another celebrity rant, it was a cultural moment, a searing reflection of the anxiety and outrage gripping much of the nation. It was an event that transcended political divisions, forcing Americans of all beliefs to confront an uncomfortable truth. The country had reached a point of deep and potentially irreparable polarization. His words, delivered with unwavering confidence and clarity, left an impact that few political figures had managed to achieve in the months leading up to and following Trump's shocking victory. This wasn't just about Jackson taking a stance, it was about the broader implications of what he had said. The fact that a Hollywood actor had managed to articulate the fear and frustration of millions in a way that traditional politicians had failed to underscore just how disconnected the political establishment had become from the people they claimed to serve. Jackson's speech resonated because it was brutally honest, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. There were no carefully rehearsed political statements, no attempt to soften the blow for the sake of diplomacy. It was raw, and in that rawness, it became more powerful than any speech delivered by a career politician. As Jackson's words spread like wildfire across television and social media, they became more than just a viral moment. They became a rallying cry. For those who had already viewed Trump as an existential threat to democracy, Jackson's speech validated their concerns and reinforced their determination to resist. He gave them a voice, a public figure willing to stand up and say what so many had been thinking but had lacked the platform to express. His words were not just a critique, but a warning, a plea for Americans to remain engaged and to hold their leaders accountable before it was too late. At the heart of Jackson's critique was the idea that Trump's presidency represented more than just a political shift. It was a test of American values. He spoke about the danger of normalizing behavior that would have once been considered unacceptable in a leader, the risk of allowing dishonesty, division, and authoritarian tendencies to go unchecked. Jackson's words were a reminder that democracy was fragile, that it required constant vigilance to sustain, and that history had shown time and time again how easily a nation could slip into chaos when citizens failed to act. Jackson was not naive about the consequences of his words. He understood the backlash that would come, that Trump's supporters would accuse him of being an out-of-touch Hollywood elite, that political pundits would debate whether celebrities had any place in political discourse. But Jackson did not care. He had not spoken out for applause or attention. He had spoken out because he felt it was his duty to do so. He knew that remaining silent in the face of what he saw as an impending crisis was not an option. The backlash came swiftly. Right-wing media outlets dismissed Jackson's speech as yet another example of Hollywood arrogance, claiming that wealthy actors had no business lecturing working-class Americans about politics. Trump's most fervent supporters flooded social media with messages of outrage, calling for boycotts of Jackson's films and accusing him of disrespecting the office of the presidency. Some politicians even used his words as a rallying point, claiming that they demonstrated the supposed disdain that the entertainment industry had for everyday Americans. Yet despite the backlash, Jackson's words continued to resonate. His speech tapped into something deeper than just opposition to Trump. It tapped into a collective anxiety about the future of the country. It was not just Democrats or progressives who found themselves nodding along to his words. Even some conservatives, those who had grown uneasy with Trump's erratic behavior and divisive rhetoric, found themselves unable to ignore the truths Jackson had laid bare. His critique transcended political labels and forced a conversation about what kind of leadership America truly needed. One of the most remarkable aspects of Jackson's speech was how it highlighted the evolving role of celebrities in American politics. While entertainers had always had influence, the era of Trump had blurred the lines between politics and pop culture in unprecedented ways. Trump himself had risen to power largely on the strength of his celebrity persona, using his years as a reality television star to craft an image of himself as a successful, no-nonsense businessman. His election had shattered traditional expectations of what a politician should be, and in doing so, it had opened the door for figures outside of the political establishment to have an even greater impact on public discourse. Jackson's speech was proof that in this new political reality, the voices of actors, musicians, and other public figures could no longer be dismissed as mere distractions. They had become vital players in shaping the national conversation, capable of reaching audiences that traditional politicians could not. Whether one agreed with him or not, there was no denying that his words had power, and that power was something that could not be ignored. The sheer intensity of Jackson's critique also forced a reckoning within the entertainment industry itself. While many celebrities had spoken out against Trump in the past, few had done so with the level of directness and forcefulness that Jackson had. His speech set a new precedent, challenging other public figures to move beyond vague statements of concern and take a stronger, more unequivocal stance. It was no longer enough to simply tweet dissatisfaction or make subtle jabs in award show speeches. Jackson had demonstrated that this was a moment that required real, fearless action. His words also reignited discussions about the responsibility of those in positions of influence. Should celebrities use their platforms to speak out on political issues? Or should they stay in their lane and focus on entertainment? Jackson made it clear that he believed the latter was not an option. He argued that to remain silent in the face of injustice was to be complicit, that fame came with a responsibility to use one's voice for something greater than personal gain. His speech challenged others in Hollywood to reconsider their role in the political landscape and to recognize that they had the ability and perhaps even the obligation to shape the future of the country. Another striking aspect of Jackson's critique was its emphasis on historical context. He drew parallels between Trump's rise and other moments in history where fear and division had been weaponized for political gain. He reminded Americans that democracy was not something that could be taken for granted, that history had shown how quickly a nation could slide into authoritarianism when its citizens were not paying attention. His words were a reminder that the warning signs were there and that ignoring them would be a mistake that future generations would pay for. Beyond the immediate impact of his speech, Jackson's words also posed a larger question about the role of resistance in times of political upheaval. Was it enough to simply criticize from the sidelines, or was it necessary to take direct action? Jackson made it clear that words alone would not be enough. that those who were concerned about the direction of the country needed to translate their frustration into meaningful action. He called for vigilance, for engagement, for an unwavering commitment to the principles of democracy. His speech was not just about condemning Trump, it was about inspiring people to do something about it. As the dust settled from Jackson's explosive television appearance, the country found itself grappling with the deeper truths his words had exposed. The divisions in America were real, and they were not going away anytime soon. The fears he had articulated were shared by millions, and the questions he had raised about the future of democracy were ones that could not be ignored. Whether one loved or hated what he had said, there was no denying that he had forced a conversation that the country desperately needed to have. The significance of Jackson's speech extended far beyond the political moment in which it was delivered. It was a reflection of a broader cultural shift, a sign that the lines between politics and entertainment had blurred in ways that could not be undone. It was proof that in the modern era, influence was not limited to those who held elected office, that in times of crisis, voices from unexpected places could rise to the forefront and shape the course of history. As America moved forward, the impact of Jackson's words would continue to be felt. His speech had set a new standard for political engagement, proving that speaking truth to power was not just the responsibility of politicians, but of anyone with a platform large enough to make a difference. Whether or not his warnings would be heeded remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: Samuel L. Jackson had made his mark on history, and his words would not be forgotten. Samuel L. Jackson's public condemnation of Donald Trump's presidency was more than just a speech. It was an eruption, a cultural lightning strike that sent ripples across the nation. The sheer force of his words resonated deeply with those who had already been disillusioned by Trump's rise, but it also forced even his supporters to reckon with the criticisms he laid bare. His words were not carefully measured or politically calculated. They were the raw, unfiltered truth as he saw it. And in a time when political discourse had been reduced to sound bites and half-truths, that level of unvarnished honesty was both shocking and refreshing. Jackson's dismantling of Trump was more than just a scathing critique of one man. It was an indictment of an entire movement and entire ideology that had allowed Trump to ascend to power. He spoke not just about Trump's policies and personal flaws, but about the broader forces that had given rise to his presidency. The fear-mongering, the misinformation, the deliberate stoking of division that had consumed American politics. Jackson was not content to simply criticize Trump himself. He wanted to hold accountable the enablers, the media, the political figures who had remained silent when they should have spoken up, and even the voters who had willingly embraced a figure whose campaign was built on exclusion and resentment. What set Jackson's speech apart from the countless other celebrity critiques of Trump was its depth. He didn't just express outrage, he laid out in precise detail the consequences of Trump's words and actions. He illustrated how Trump's rhetoric had emboldened hate groups, how his policies had already begun to dismantle fundamental rights, and how his approach to governance seemed more focused on self-aggrandizement than on serving the American people. Every accusation was backed by examples, every claim supported by irrefutable evidence. It was not just an emotional plea, it was an intellectual and moral argument that left little room for rebuttal. Jackson also highlighted a troubling trend that had emerged during Trump's rise: the normalization of behavior that, in any other era, would have been considered disqualifying for a president. He pointed out that Trump had shattered the expectations of decency and integrity that had long been associated with the office, replacing them with a brand of politics that thrived on chaos and spectacle. In doing so, he forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable question: had America become so numb to scandal and outrage that it no longer recognized the warning signs of authoritarianism? Had the bar been lowered so drastically that blatant dishonesty and open corruption were now seen as acceptable? The response to Jackson's speech was immediate and intense. While many praised his boldness, others attempted to dismiss him, arguing that actors should stay out of politics. Yet that argument ignored a fundamental reality. Trump himself was not a career politician, but a former reality television star who had leveraged his celebrity status to win the presidency. If Trump's entertainment background had not disqualified him from leading the country, why should Jackson's prevent him from speaking out? The hypocrisy of such criticisms only further validated Jackson's argument that the lines between politics and entertainment had been permanently blurred. Beyond the political implications, Jackson's speech also raised important questions about the role of public figures in shaping discourse. Historically, Hollywood had always played a role in activism, from the civil rights movement to anti-war protests, but Trump's presidency had heightened that role to unprecedented levels. Jackson's speech was not just an expression of personal opinion, it was a demonstration of how cultural figures could serve as moral compasses in times of crisis. His words carried weight precisely because he was not a politician beholden to donors or political parties. He was a citizen, using his voice to advocate for what he believed was right. The timing of Jackson's speech also played a crucial role in its impact. It came at a moment when the country was still grappling with the shock of Trump's election, when uncertainty and fear were at their peak. For many, his words provided a sense of validation and reassurance, a reminder that they were not alone in their concerns. For others, it served as a wake-up call, forcing them to reckon with the reality of what Trump's presidency represented. The fact that his words spread so rapidly across social media and news networks only underscored the hunger for that kind of clarity and directness. Another significant aspect of Jackson's speech was the way it challenged the idea that opposition to Trump was solely a partisan issue. While his words were undeniably critical of Trump's policies and leadership style, they were framed not as an attack on Republicans as a whole, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and political complacency. He called out not only Trump's most fervent supporters, but also those who had chosen to remain neutral, those who had excused Trump's behavior out of political convenience. His argument was clear. This was not just about party politics. This was about the future of the country. His speech also underscored the power of language in shaping political reality. One of the most alarming aspects of Trump's rise had been his ability to manipulate language, to twist facts, and to create an alternate version of reality in which truth no longer seemed to matter. Jackson directly confronted this, refusing to allow Trump's distortions to go unchallenged. He reminded viewers that words have power, that history has shown how dangerous it can be when leaders use language to deceive, divide, and delegitimize their critics. His speech was, in many ways, an attempt to reclaim the narrative, to cut through the noise and force people to confront the truth. The intensity of Jackson's critique also reflected the broader sense of urgency that many Americans were feeling. He was not speaking as someone engaging in a political debate. He was speaking as someone who genuinely feared for the future of his country. That sense of urgency was palpable in his delivery, in the way his voice carried not just frustration but deep concern. He was not just making a point, he was issuing a call to action. His words were a demand for accountability, a plea for Americans to resist apathy and to recognize the gravity of the moment. Jackson's critique also highlighted an important shift in the way politics was being discussed in the modern era. In the past, political commentary had been largely confined to news networks and op-ed pages. But with the rise of social media and the increasing intersection of politics and culture, figures like Jackson had become just as influential, if not more so, than traditional political commentators. His speech was a perfect example of how public discourse had evolved, how platforms beyond the traditional political sphere had become battlegrounds for ideological debate. While his speech was undeniably divisive, it also had an undeniable impact. It forced conversations that many had been avoiding. It challenged the narratives that had dominated the political landscape, and it served as a reminder that resistance could come from anywhere. Jackson had used his platform to deliver a message that needed to be heard, and in doing so, he had left a mark on the national consciousness. Looking beyond the immediate impact of Jackson's words, his speech also set a precedent for future political activism among celebrities. While Hollywood had always had its outspoken figures, Jackson's speech raised the stakes, demonstrating that criticism of political leaders could be both substantive and fearless. He had shown that it was not enough to simply express discontent in vague terms. True resistance required specificity, conviction, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. As America moved forward, the question remained: would Jackson's words serve as a catalyst for change, or would they be just another moment in an era defined by outrage? Regardless of the answer, one thing was certain: Samuel L. Jackson had not just spoken his mind. He had created a moment that would be remembered, analyzed, and discussed for years to come. His words had been an act of defiance, a declaration that silence was not an option, and a testament to the enduring power of truth in an age of deception. Samuel L. Jackson's searing takedown of Donald Trump was more than just a moment of television spectacle. It was a cultural shift, a moment that redefined the role of celebrity activism in an era where the lines between entertainment and politics had all but disappeared. His speech was not just about criticizing a president. It was about igniting a movement, about shaking people from complacency and forcing them to recognize that their democracy was at a crossroads. One of the most striking elements of Jackson's words was their sense of urgency. He did not frame his critique as a mere political disagreement, but as a dire warning. His speech carried the weight of history, a reminder that democracy is fragile and that once it begins to erode, it can be nearly impossible to restore. He evoked past moments when unchecked power had led to disaster, cautioning that the country could not afford to ignore the warning signs simply because they came wrapped in the spectacle of Trump's brash personality. The intensity of Jackson's critique also reflected something deeper: the exhaustion and frustration of a country that had been bombarded with scandal, misinformation, and political turmoil. Trump's rise had been fueled by his ability to dominate the news cycle, to command attention through controversy and bombast. But Jackson's speech cut through that noise in a way few others had managed. It was not an attempt to counter Trump with equal theatrics. It was an assertion of truth over spectacle, of moral clarity over political gamesmanship. What made Jackson's words especially impactful was that he did not shy away from uncomfortable topics. He tackled head-on the racial and social tensions that had been exacerbated by Trump's rhetoric, calling attention to the ways in which hate speech had been emboldened, how marginalized communities were being put at risk, and how the very idea of equality was under threat. He spoke about the real-world consequences of Trump's words, about the rise in hate crimes, about the fears of immigrants and minorities who no longer felt safe in their own country. It was a speech that refused to sanitize reality, that refused to pretend that Trump's presidency was simply another political shift rather than a fundamental departure from democratic norms. Jackson also addressed the complicity of those who had remained silent, a point that made his words resonate even beyond those who already opposed Trump. He argued that it was not just Trump's actions that were dangerous, but the widespread willingness to normalize them. He condemned the media for treating his most outrageous statements as mere entertainment, for failing to hold him accountable in the ways they had past presidents. He called out political leaders who had chosen self-preservation over principle, those who had once opposed Trump, but had quickly fallen in line when it became politically advantageous. At the core of Jackson's message was a simple but powerful idea: democracy only works if people actively defend it. He warned against political apathy, against the belief that things would simply sort themselves out. He urged people to stay engaged, to vote, to organize, to refuse to accept corruption and incompetence as the new norm. His words were a rallying cry for resistance, for action, for a refusal to be lulled into complacency by the sheer volume of chaos that had come to define Trump's presidency. In the days that followed, Jackson's speech continued to reverberate, sparking discussions not just about Trump, but about the responsibility of public figures in shaping political discourse. He had set a precedent for boldness, showing that it was possible to speak out with clarity and conviction without resorting to vague platitudes. His words had not just condemned Trump, they had challenged an entire system that had allowed such a figure to rise to power. And in doing so, he had ensured that his voice would not just be heard in that moment, but remembered long after. Samuel L. Jackson's speech became a defining moment in the ongoing struggle over truth, accountability, and the direction of American democracy. His unflinching words reminded people that silence in times of crisis is never neutral. It is a choice, one that enables injustice. By using his platform to challenge not just Trump but the culture of complicity surrounding him, Jackson set a new standard for political engagement in entertainment. His message was clear: the stakes were too high for indifference. In an era dominated by misinformation and division, his voice cut through the chaos, demanding that people wake up and act. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Samuel L. Jackson's remarks about President Trump? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.